I never thought I'd see the day. A day when a German prisoner of war, starved and broken, would step off a transport truck and look around, confused, bewildered, as if expecting his worst nightmare to come to life. But this was different. He wasn't walking into the cold, barren, unforgiving land of a Russian POW camp. He was walking into something he couldn't yet comprehend. This was the United States. This was a different world. Friedrich Weber, a man hardened by years of war, his body emaciated and bruised, stepped onto the sun-soaked grounds of an American military base. It was hot. The air felt thick, but not in the suffocating way he had grown used to. Here, there was something strange, something almost inviting about the place. He had heard whispers, rumors, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He was used to the endless cold of the Russian steppes, the constant fear of starvation, the terrifying brutality that seemed to define his existence for the past few years. And now this. The truck doors opened, and as he stepped down onto the dirt road, the first thing he noticed was the sky. It was so blue, so bright, a stark contrast to the overcast, gray skies of the Eastern Front. And then there was the ground beneath his feet, solid and dry, not the mud-soaked land he had trudged through for months. It was almost unreal. Friedrich felt a pit form in his stomach as he looked around. The military camp stretched before him, organized and clean, with neat rows of tents and vehicles, soldiers moving purposefully, their uniforms immaculate. But it wasn't the soldiers that caught his attention. It was the civilians. In the distance, he saw farmers working the land, their actions deliberate and smooth, as if they were at peace, as if they were living. The sight was almost too much for him to process. He had been told that the Americans were barbarians, that they treated prisoners with cruelty beyond imagination. The propaganda had painted them as heartless, savage people. Yet here he was, standing in front of something completely different. A man in a uniform, not much older than Friedrich, approached him with a slow, deliberate gait. John Miller, a young soldier from Texas, looked at Friedrich and the other prisoners with a sense of duty, but also with something more. Curiosity. He had heard the stories of the brutal German soldiers, the enemy, the ones who had caused so much pain. But now, standing face to face with these men, he couldn't help but see the exhaustion in their eyes, the deep weariness that came from months, maybe years, of constant suffering. John knew what he was supposed to do, what his orders were. He was supposed to keep the prisoners in line, make sure they worked and didn't escape. But there was something about these men, or perhaps it was the women, the ones who had been captured as auxiliaries, that made him question everything. He stood there for a moment, looking at the weary faces in front of him. The others were being processed, given their numbers, their paperwork. But John was still focused on Friedrich. Without thinking, he offered him a canteen of water, and to his surprise, Friedrich didn't hesitate. He took the canteen and drank, his hands shaking as the cool water slid down his throat. It was the first time in months that he had felt something other than fear or hunger. The water wasn't just a drink. It was a sign that he wasn't in the same hellhole he had been just days before. Maybe, just maybe, this place would be different. He wiped his mouth and handed the canteen back, looking at John with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. John gave him a nod, a small gesture, but one that said more than words could express. In that moment, Friedrich began to understand that this wasn't going to be the nightmare he had expected. This was something entirely new, something he couldn't yet comprehend. And as the truck doors closed behind him, he was left with one thought, one question. Could this really be heaven? The next few days felt like a blur for Friedrich Weber. The hot sun of the American South beat down on him as he adjusted to his new reality. The camp, though still a prison, was different from anything he had ever known. The fences were high, and the guards, though watchful, moved with a nonchalance that was hard to understand. There was no constant fear of abuse, no expectation of cruelty. In fact, the worst thing Friedrich had felt since arriving was the weight of his own disbelief. He had expected horror, starvation, and violence. But instead, he was given meals that filled him up, a bed that didn't feel like a punishment, and the smallest shred of comfort he hadn't thought possible. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a dream. John Miller, the soldier who had offered him water on that first day, had continued to check on him. At first, it had been awkward. A nod here, a silent wave there. But over the next few days, things began to change. One morning, As Friedrich was working with a group of prisoners, he noticed John walking toward him. This time, there was no water, no small gesture of kindness. Instead, John handed him a small, square package. Friedrich looked at it, puzzled. John smiled and nodded. "Go ahead, it's for you," he said. Hesitant, Friedrich carefully unwrapped the package. Inside, there were 2 slices of bread, a slice of cheese, and a few strips of cold, roasted meat. It wasn't much, but it was more than Friedrich had expected to receive. His stomach growled loudly, but he felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just food. This was something else, something human. He looked up at John, unsure how to respond. I don't know what to say," Friedrich said, his voice thick with emotion. John shrugged, his smile warm but unassuming. "No need for words. Just eat." For the first time since his capture, Friedrich felt something other than fear and despair. He ate slowly, savoring every bite. It wasn't the finest meal he'd ever had, but it was more than he could have hoped for. He felt the energy slowly returning to his body, the hunger starting to recede. As he finished, John watched him with a quiet intensity. "How's it taste?" John asked. It's good," Friedrich replied, his voice barely a whisper. John's expression softened. "Good. I'm glad." There was something in John's eyes now, something different from before. It wasn't just the detached professionalism of a soldier. It was something more personal, more genuine. As the days passed, Friedrich found himself waiting for these small moments of connection with John. It wasn't just about food or water anymore. It was the human connection, the simple acts of kindness that kept him going, that made him start to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the war. Every time he saw John, a little bit of the wall he had built around himself began to crumble. He could feel himself beginning to trust again, something he hadn't done in years. John, for his part, had seen something in Friedrich that reminded him of the people he'd left behind back in Texas. He had grown up in a small town, where neighbors helped each other without a second thought. It was a different world from the one he had been thrust into during the war, but in that small, simple act of handing over food, he had begun to see that there was more to the world than just fighting and survival. It was a lesson that both of them were learning, though they didn't know it yet. One evening, as Friedrich sat alone in his barracks, he thought about his life before the war. It felt so far away now, a different life, a different person. He had been a teacher, a man with hopes and dreams. But those dreams had been buried under the weight of the war. Now, in this strange American camp, he felt something stirring inside him. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the human need for connection. Either way, it felt like a beginning. And as Friedrich lay down that night, he thought about what John had said, about the meal, about the small acts of kindness. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger, something worth believing in. I have never been more unsure of myself. Each day that passed since Friedrich had arrived at the American camp, he had felt something shift, a constant, subtle change that he could not name. It wasn't just the food or the comfort of a bed that he had never dared to dream of. It was the warmth, the humanity in the small gestures that the Americans seemed to offer so freely. Each time he saw John Miller, the soldier who had given him water, the distance between them seemed to lessen, even though neither of them had said a word about it. The kindness was there, in the way John would nod to him when they passed each other, in the way he would offer a small smile, as if they shared a secret, one that spoke of something more than just the war. John, too, had begun to notice the change in Friedrich. At first, the man had been like a shell, hard and cold, focused only on survival. But now, there was something more, something vulnerable, something that John recognized, something human. It reminded him of the people back home in Texas. Simple, honest, hard-working people who had learned to trust because they had no other choice. The days were becoming easier for Friedrich, but with that ease came a new problem. How could he reconcile the kindness he had been shown with everything he had been taught? The propaganda had painted the Americans as the enemy, the people who would break you if you weren't careful. But the reality was something he couldn't deny. The Americans had treated him and the others with more dignity than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, Friedrich found himself searching for answers to questions he had never asked before. What would happen when the war ended? What would his life be like if he ever made it home? He couldn't fathom it. The war had stolen so much from him, his family, his country, his very sense of self. And yet, here he was, in this strange land, where people treated him like a human being, not a prisoner. That night, as Friedrich lay on the hard bed in the barracks, he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He had started to dream again. Dreams of a world beyond the war, a world where kindness was not a rare commodity, but something everyone could offer. Dreams where the war didn't define his existence. As he lay there, he heard footsteps outside, a soft shuffle that he had come to recognize. It was John. The soldier had come to check on him again. Friedrich wasn't sure why, but he had started to look forward to those moments. John wasn't just doing his duty anymore. There was something personal in the way he approached Friedrich now, as if the line between soldier and prisoner had blurred. John entered the barracks quietly, looking around before spotting Friedrich's bed. He smiled when he saw that Friedrich was awake. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice gentle. Friedrich shook his head. "I don't know how to. There's too much on my mind." John sat down on the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed, his eyes warm. "You want to talk about it?" Friedrich hesitated. He wasn't sure what he would say. The truth was, he didn't know what he was feeling. He only knew that it was new, unfamiliar. "I don't know how to feel, John. I've been told my whole life that people like you, Americans, are my enemies. That you would never treat us with any kindness." John nodded, his face thoughtful. "I get it," he said softly. "I was raised to believe the same about Germans. But then I met you and the others, and I realized something. We're all just people, trying to survive, trying to do what's right, even if it's hard." Friedrich looked at him, searching his face for any sign of falsehood. He found none. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Friedrich said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know how to reconcile what I've been told with what I'm seeing." John's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Friedrich's shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. It's okay to feel confused. But maybe, just maybe, this is a start. Maybe this is a way out of the hate and the anger." Friedrich nodded slowly, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. "Maybe it is," he murmured. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant rustle of the wind outside. It was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with something deeper, something unspoken. "You're not alone in this, Friedrich," John said, his voice steady. "I'll be here, whether you need to talk or not." For the first time in a long while, Friedrich believed him. He didn't have all the answers, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. There was kindness in this world, even in the most unexpected places. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start over. I had never imagined that a small gesture could change so much. It had been weeks since Friedrich had first set foot on American soil, weeks since he had been given water by a soldier who had no reason to care about him. And yet, with each passing day, the weight of his disbelief started to melt away, piece by piece. The camp was still a prison, but the difference now was that it was a place that held more than just confinement. It held the possibility of something new, something unexpected. John Miller continued to check in on Friedrich, as he did with all the other prisoners. But with Friedrich, there was something different. A quiet understanding had developed between them, a bond that was not spoken but was felt in the small exchanges they shared. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp, Friedrich sat alone by the fence, looking out at the horizon. He hadn't spoken to anyone about the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind for days. He wasn't sure how to put them into words, but the questions lingered, about the war, about the future, about the man he had become. He wasn't the same Friedrich that had crossed into Russia, nor the same man who had marched through the endless stretches of barren land. He was someone else now, someone who had started to believe that kindness could exist, even in the darkest of places. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard the soft sound of boots on the dirt road. "John." He turned his head, and their eyes met. Without a word, John sat beside him, the weight of his presence a quiet comfort. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. They were both waiting, perhaps for something to happen, perhaps for the words that were too hard to say. Finally, it was John who broke the silence. "You're quieter than usual today, Friedrich. Something on your mind?" Friedrich hesitated. It had been a long time since he had opened up to anyone, let alone an American soldier. But there was something about John's presence, something that made him feel safe, something that made him feel like he could finally talk. "I don't know," Friedrich said slowly, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the war. About what comes after it. What comes after all this is over? John nodded. It's a lot to think about. I've been thinking about it too. What we all go back to, after the war ends. You think you'll go home? Friedrich looked down at his hands. He wasn't sure what to say. The idea of returning to a home that no longer existed was almost too much to bear. His village had been destroyed, his family scattered. He had nothing left to return to. I don't know if I can go back, he said quietly. Everything is gone. My family, my life, my country, all of it. I don't even know if I have a place to go. John's face softened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Instead, he just placed a hand on Friedrich's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes. I can't imagine what that feels like, John said. But you don't have to go through it alone. Not anymore. The sincerity in his voice made Friedrich's heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't pity, not the kind he had felt from others in the past. It was something else, something that made him believe, for the first time in a long while, that maybe there was a chance for something better, something beyond the ashes of the war. As the days passed, Friedrich found himself looking at John in a new light. The soldier who had once seemed like an enemy, a symbol of everything he had been taught to fear, had become something different. A friend, a person who cared. Friedrich had started to see the world through different eyes. He no longer saw the enemy, the German soldier, the prisoner. He saw people who had been hurt by the same war, who were struggling with the same questions, the same loss. And as the seasons changed and the war began to wind down, Friedrich realized that perhaps the real battle wasn't just about survival. It was about what came next. What came after the war was over. What came after the hatred and the destruction. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. He wasn't facing it alone. I had not realized how deeply a small act could resonate, how it could shift the course of your days, your thoughts, your very existence. It had been months since I first set foot in this American camp, and with every passing day, I found myself peeling away layers of fear, distrust, and hopelessness that had once defined my life. The war had stolen so much, and yet here I was, in a place that seemed as foreign as it was unexpected, surrounded by people who were kind in ways I had never imagined possible. And none of that would have happened without John Miller. He had given me water on that first day, a simple act that began a slow but steady unraveling of the walls I had built around myself. Since then, I had started to trust again, not just him, but the world around me. Trusting again felt like a dangerous thing, like stepping into a space you no longer recognized. But there it was, slow, steady, and undeniable. I had been so used to feeling the weight of suspicion, of expecting the worst, of always bracing for the pain that came with every new encounter. But now, when I saw John, when I spoke to him, I didn't feel that. What I felt was something else, something warm, something human. Over the weeks, John and I had shared more than just quiet nods or exchanged words of basic pleasantries. We had begun to talk, not just about the war or the daily tasks we were assigned, but about life. What came before all of this and what might come after. I had begun to open up, a little at a time, about my family, about the life I had lost, and John had listened. He never pushed me to talk, but when I did, he didn't look at me like a soldier with a job to do. He looked at me like a man who understood what it was to lose everything. It was the first time in years that I didn't feel alone. One evening, as the camp settled into its usual quiet, John found me sitting by the fence again, staring out at the wide expanse of land that stretched out beyond the gates. The horizon, endless and open, felt like both a promise and a reminder of all I had lost. He sat beside me, and for a long time, we said nothing. I didn't need him to say anything. I just needed his presence, the quiet reassurance that somehow, even in this foreign land, I wasn't lost. Finally, John spoke. You ever think about what comes next, Friedrich? His voice was low, as if he was careful not to break the silence we had shared. After the war, I mean. I paused. I had thought about it, of course, but the thought always felt like something too big to face, something too far in the distance to matter. I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's hard to think about the future when everything I knew is gone. John nodded, looking out toward the camp beyond. I get that, he said, his voice carrying a weight of understanding. For me, I think about home, about what life will look like once the war's over. But it's hard to imagine, isn't it? Feels like the world's changed so much that it'll never be the same again. I nodded. feeling the truth of his words settle deep within me. The world had changed. But somehow, in the middle of all that change, I had found something I hadn't thought possible: connection. You know, John continued, his tone a little lighter now. I've been thinking about the first time we met. You were so closed off, like a man who'd seen it all and couldn't see past the next moment. But now you're different. I looked at him, unsure of what to say. I hadn't noticed the change in myself until he pointed it out. But when I thought about it, I realized he was right. I wasn't the same man who had stepped off that transport truck. I had changed, bit by bit, day by day, and I wasn't sure when it had happened. But I knew that it had. I smiled, a small, hesitant smile, and shrugged. Maybe, I said. Maybe it's because I'm starting to believe again. John's eyes softened as he looked at me, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted, just a little. I'm glad, he said, his voice quiet but genuine. You deserve to believe in something good, Friedrich. We all do. As we sat there in silence, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, I felt something shift again. It wasn't just the hope that was beginning to grow within me, but the realization that I wasn't alone in this anymore. The war had taken everything, but it had also given me something unexpected: new beginnings, new connections, and the chance to rebuild what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. I had not expected that the simple act of sitting in silence with another person could be so transformative. Each moment I spent here in the camp, each conversation with John, seemed to peel away more of the layers of fear and distrust I had built over the years. The small moments, those quiet exchanges, those acts of kindness, were changing me, shaping me into someone who could imagine a future again, a future that wasn't defined by war. As the days passed, I began to realize that my sense of time had shifted. The days no longer felt like endless stretches of survival, but as fragments of life that I could hold on to. I wasn't just marking the hours anymore. I was living them. The camp had become a place where I could breathe, even if only for a moment. It was a small thing, but it meant everything to someone like me, someone who had forgotten what it felt like to live without fear. One afternoon, John and I were working together near the camp's central barracks. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the dusty ground. I was sweeping the area, trying to keep my mind occupied when I heard John's voice. You know, he began, his voice light but serious. I never thought I'd be here, doing this. Helping you guys. I joined the army to fight the enemy. I didn't know I'd end up sitting here, talking to you, like this. I glanced up at him, surprised by his words. I don't think any of us expected this, I said, my voice low, trying to grasp the weight of what he was saying. The war has changed everything. The things we thought we knew. The people we thought we understood. John stopped for a moment, considering my words. He rubbed the back of his neck, something I had seen him do when he was deep in thought. Yeah, I guess you're right. I came here thinking I was doing the right thing, fighting for my country. But now, I'm not so sure what's right anymore. It's hard to separate what's true from what we've been told. I could feel the sincerity in his words, the struggle he was going through. It was the same struggle that had haunted me, and now it seemed like it was haunting him too. I know what you mean, I said, pausing as I swept a pile of dust into a small pile. We've all been told things about each other, things that aren't true. But when you get to know someone, really know them, those things start to fall away. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I didn't think I'd ever sit down and have a conversation with a German soldier. But here we are. He smiled, a small but genuine smile. And now, I can't imagine not knowing you. It was then that I realized just how far we had come. How far I had come. The man I was now, sitting here with John, wasn't the same man who had first arrived at this camp, fearful and distant. That man had been broken, but this man, the one who was talking to John, was slowly learning to trust again, to believe that there was more to life than just survival. And perhaps, most importantly, to believe that kindness, even in the middle of a war, could be the thing that healed you. The days passed, and the war slowly drew to a close. The front lines shifted, the fighting lessened, and soon, there were whispers that the end was near. For the first time in years, I could feel hope stirring deep inside me. I had been so focused on the present, on surviving, that I had forgotten how to dream. But now, as I sat beside John, listening to the distant sounds of the camp, I could finally see a future again. It wasn't a perfect future, but it was one worth living. A future where I could rebuild, where I could find peace, and maybe even where I could find a home again. The future, it seemed, was no longer something to fear. It was something to look forward to. And as I glanced at John, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we were both learning the same lesson. The war had taken so much from us, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken our ability to care, to connect, to believe that there was something better waiting for us on the other side. It had taken years, but now I could see it. The beginning of something new. I had never imagined that the day would come when I would find myself standing at the edge of something better, something worth looking forward to. But here I was, looking out over the camp, the once forbidden horizon now open before me, filled with possibility. The war was ending, the pieces of my past slowly falling into place, and I could almost feel the weight of the future pressing against me, urging me forward. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of hope, something I had forgotten how to feel. As the days wore on, the whispers of peace grew louder. The fighting was dying down, the front lines were shifting, and it felt as though the world was waking up from a long, brutal nightmare. But in the midst of all this, I found myself fixated on one thing: the kindness that had been shown to me. It wasn't just about the food or the comfort of a bed that didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It was about the people. People like John Miller, who had made me feel like I wasn't just a prisoner of war, but a person again. Someone worth caring about. The changes had been subtle at first. Small acts of kindness, a glance shared, a word spoken. But now, as the camp grew quieter and the end of the war seemed imminent, those small moments had added up. They had begun to reshape my understanding of what it meant to be human. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to live. I was starting to believe in something again. One evening, as the last of the daylight faded away, John and I found ourselves walking together near the edge of the camp. The air was cool, the sky clear above us, and for a moment, it felt as though everything had slowed down, just for us. We walked in silence, the weight of the past few months heavy on our shoulders, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to speak. Finally, it was John who broke the silence. "You know, Friedrich, I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I never expected this. I never expected to be standing here with you, talking like this." I looked at him, a little surprised. He had always been so certain of his role in all of this, so sure of what he was doing. "You mean talking to me?" I asked, trying to make sense of his words. John shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I thought you guys were just the enemy, the ones we were supposed to fight. But now, I don't know. I don't think I see you as the enemy anymore. You're just another person." His words, simple as they were, hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized just how much I had changed, too. The man I was before, the man who had crossed into Russia, had seen only enemies. But now, I could see that the line between us, soldier and prisoner, wasn't as clear as I had once thought. We were all just people, trying to make it through the same war, trying to survive. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad it's you here," I said, the words coming out more easily than I expected. "I thought when I came here, I'd never be able to trust anyone. But now I trust you." John looked at me, his expression softening. "I'm glad, Friedrich. That means a lot." We stood there for a moment, just the two of us, the sounds of the camp far behind us. The weight of our conversation settled in the space between us, the understanding that we had both been changed by the war, in ways neither of us could have anticipated. As the night grew darker, we continued to walk, side by side, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't walking alone. The war had stolen so much from me, but it had also given me something I never expected: a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make the future worth facing. The war was coming to an end, but this was just the beginning of something new. Something that, for the first time in years, felt like it could be mine. I had always thought that war was something you endured, that it was something that happened to you, something that defined you. I thought the scars it left on you would never fade, and I was prepared to live with that. But now, as the days drifted by and the camp began to quiet down, something inside me started to shift. It wasn't just the end of the war that was coming. It was the end of the man I had been. The war had shaped me into something I didn't recognize. But now, with the horizon of peace in sight. I could feel the parts of me that had been buried beneath years of survival slowly emerging. I wasn't the same man who had first set foot on American soil. I had learned to trust again. I had learned that kindness could exist, even in the most unlikely places. John Miller, the soldier who had shown me more humanity than I thought possible, had become more than just a fellow prisoner and guard. He had become a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a way to find light. The war had made enemies out of us, but here, in the midst of it all, I had found a friend. One morning, as the camp stirred to life, I found myself walking toward the barracks where I usually worked. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the camp. The air was warm, and the sounds of the soldiers preparing for the day filled the air. It was a typical morning, but something felt different. It wasn't the routine or the endless tasks. It was the realization that everything was about to change. The war was ending, and so was this chapter of my life. As I walked, I saw John standing near the fence, looking out toward the horizon. He had become a fixture in my life, and yet, in a strange way, I knew that this moment was the last time we would share this silence. The war would end, and we would both return to lives we had left behind. I stopped beside him, not knowing what to say. For once, words felt unnecessary. John looked at me and smiled. "You know, Friedrich, I never imagined we'd be standing here like this, after everything that's happened." His voice was soft, but there was a certain finality to it. "But I'm glad we are." I nodded, unsure of what to say in return. I didn't need to. The feeling between us was enough. It was the quiet understanding that we had both been through something we would never fully be able to explain, but something that had changed us forever. "Me too," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. We stood there for a moment, just watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The world was waking up, and so were we. The future was still uncertain, but I no longer feared it. I wasn't alone anymore. The silence between us felt comfortable, not heavy. It was the kind of silence that came when two people had shared something deep, something that words couldn't capture. The war had taken so much from us. It had stolen years, families, and lives. But in the end, it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken our ability to connect. It hadn't taken our ability to find humanity in each other. The camp was quiet now, the air filled with the sounds of men preparing to leave behind the only life they had known for the past several years. I could hear the distant rumble of trucks starting up, the clinking of metal as soldiers packed up their gear. The end of an era was coming. But in that moment, I realized that the end of the war didn't have to mean the end of the connections we had made. The friendships we had forged here, in the most unlikely of places, would remain. It was hard to imagine, but I knew that when we left, we would carry something with us, something more powerful than the bitterness or hatred that had once defined us. We would carry the lessons we had learned from one another. And that, I realized, was the only thing that truly mattered. As we turned to walk back toward the camp, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The war had shaped me, but it wouldn't define me anymore. I was ready for whatever came next. The future was no longer a source of fear. It was something to look forward to. And I wasn't facing it alone. I never imagined I would feel the weight of freedom the way I did that morning. It was strange, stepping into a world that felt like it belonged to someone else, a world where I was no longer a prisoner of war, but just a man trying to find his place. The camp was different now. The soldiers were preparing to leave. The rumble of trucks and the bustle of packing filled the air. The war was ending, and with it, the life I had known for so long. As I walked through the camp, the sounds of the soldiers filled the air. There was a sense of finality in the air, a quiet anticipation of what would come next. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Not the fleeting kind that came with every victory in battle, but a quiet, steady hope that things could be better. The past months had been filled with moments of kindness, small acts that reminded me of what it meant to be human. And now, as the camp quieted, I realized that I had learned something important. I had learned that despite everything the war had taken from me, I could still believe in something good. I could still believe in people. As the trucks pulled out of the camp, I stood at the edge, watching the dust settle in the morning sun. John was standing beside me, his eyes focused on the horizon. "It's over," he said softly, as if the words didn't quite feel real. I nodded. "It is." We both stood there, the silence between us filled with an understanding that didn't need words. It had been a long road to this point, and now, as the war ended, we both knew that things would never be the same again. I wasn't sure where the future would take me, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I had lived through the worst the world could throw at me, and now, I could look forward to the rest of my life. It felt strange to think about it that way, but it also felt right. The man I had been when I first arrived in this camp was gone. I had shed that version of myself, the version that had been nothing more than a shadow of the man I used to be. I had begun to believe again, to see the world with new eyes. I could see the kindness in the people around me, the humanity that had once been obscured by the war. As I turned to John, I realized that the bond we had formed here would stay with me long after the camp was empty and the trucks had disappeared into the distance. John had become more than just a fellow soldier, more than just a man I had met in the chaos of war. He had become a reminder that there was still goodness in the world. He had shown me that, even in the darkest moments, there was always something worth holding on to. The trucks were almost gone now, and the camp was quiet once more. I could feel the weight of the silence, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the kind of silence that came with the end of something, the kind that promised new beginnings. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. The future was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was ready to face it. I wasn't sure what it would bring, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had learned that people, even in the midst of war, could be good, and that was enough to give me hope for the future. I could feel the weight of everything shifting, the last vestiges of a life defined by war slowly crumbling away. It had been months since I first arrived at the American camp, and I knew that everything was about to change. The soldiers had left, and the camp that had once been filled with tension, fear, and uncertainty was now a quiet place of reflection. It felt like the calm after the storm, the kind of stillness that held the promise of something new, something different. As I stood there, watching the final traces of the war fade into the distance, I realized that the war had taken so much from me, but it had also given me something I didn't expect, a chance at a new life. I was no longer the man who had crossed into this land, weary and broken, expecting nothing more than survival. I had learned to trust again. I had learned that there was more to this world than just fighting and surviving. There was kindness, humanity, and the possibility of something better. And in the quiet of that moment, as the last of the trucks disappeared into the horizon, I knew that my journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. I turned toward the camp, taking in the stillness. The barracks were empty now, the sounds of soldiers and prisoners replaced by the soft whispers of the wind. It felt like a dream, this quiet, peaceful camp that had once been a place of war. I walked through the empty streets, my steps slow, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I thought about the life I had left behind, about the family I had lost, about the man I had been. I thought about John and the quiet friendship we had built, about the kindness he had shown me when I had nothing left to give. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. What would the future hold for me now? The world was different. I was different. I had started to believe again, and that was something I hadn't thought possible. As I reached the edge of the camp, I paused for a moment, looking out at the vast expanse of land beyond. The horizon stretched out before me, endless and unknown. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. The future was no longer something I feared. It was something I could face. I turned and made my way toward the small group of survivors who remained. We were all starting over, in one way or another. We had lost so much, but we still had each other. And that, in itself, was something worth holding on to. As I approached the others, I saw familiar faces, some of them tired, others hopeful. We had all come from different places, but now, in the aftermath of war, we were all in the same place. The future was uncertain, but there was a strange comfort in knowing that we were no longer alone. We had found a way to survive, and now, together, we would find a way to rebuild. I didn't know where my journey would take me, but I knew one thing for sure. The war was over, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The darkness of the past was slowly fading, replaced by a new kind of light, a light that promised hope, redemption, and the possibility of a better tomorrow. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who had shared this journey with me, I knew that the future was no longer a mystery. It was a path I could walk, one step at a time, toward a new beginning. I stood at the edge of the camp, the last of the trucks fading into the distance, and for a moment, it felt like the world had paused. Everything had changed so quickly. The war was over. The soldiers had left, and the prisoners who had once been caught in the endless cycle of conflict were now free to move forward, to find their own path. But for me, that freedom felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. I had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, I found myself uncertain about what to do next. The weight of the past still clung to me, but it was different now. I had survived. I had seen the worst of the war, and yet I was still here, standing on the edge of something new. As I walked through the now empty camp, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The faces of the soldiers and prisoners, the conversations shared in the quiet moments between battles, the small acts of kindness that had begun to reshape my understanding of the world. It all felt distant now, like a dream I had lived through. But there was no more war to define me, no more chaos to distract me. It was just me now, walking into an uncertain future. I had learned so much over the past months, not just about the world, but about myself. I had learned that it was possible to trust again, to believe that there was something good left in this world. And I had learned that even in the darkest of times, there were moments of light. The bond one had formed with John Miller was one of those moments. We had shared something profound, something that went beyond the war and the roles we had played. We had shared a sense of humanity, a connection that transcended nationality, rank, and duty. I wasn't sure if I would ever see him again. The future seemed too uncertain for promises to hold any weight. But I knew one thing, I wouldn't forget him. I wouldn't forget the kindness he had shown me when I needed it the most. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, I found myself standing by the fence, just as I had done so many times before. But this time, it felt different. The weight of the past had started to lift, and in its place, a sense of possibility had begun to grow. I wasn't sure where my life would take me now. I wasn't sure if I would return to the ruins of my homeland, or if I would find a new place to call home. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had the power to choose. The war had stripped me of so much, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken my ability to dream, to hope, and to rebuild. I had seen the worst of humanity, but I had also seen its best. And as the world around me began to change, I realized that I was ready to face whatever came next. The camp was empty now, the trucks gone, and the last remnants of the war faded into the distance. But as I stood there, I knew that the Real journey was just beginning. I wasn't the man who had first arrived here, lost and broken. I was someone different now. Someone who had learned to trust again, who had learned that kindness could exist even in the darkest of places. And as I turned away from the camp, my steps felt lighter than they ever had before. The future was waiting for me, and I was ready to face it, one step at a time. I had no idea what awaited me beyond the horizon, but standing there, watching the camp fade into the distance, I knew I had a choice. The future that once seemed so distant, so unattainable, now felt within reach. The war was over. The trucks had driven off, and the camp was quiet. The reality that had defined my life for so long, survival, uncertainty, fear, was gone. And in its place, something new, something hopeful, began to take shape. As I walked further from the camp, my footsteps slow and deliberate, I could feel the weight of the years lifting off me, like a burden finally set down. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken my ability to rebuild, to find new meaning in life. For the first time in ages, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't just a survivor, but a man with a purpose, a man who could choose what came next. The landscape around me seemed to stretch on forever, the wide-open spaces of the countryside offering an unexpected kind of freedom. It was a freedom I hadn't felt in so long, a freedom that didn't come with fear or guilt. It was a feeling that allowed me to breathe without the weight of constant dread in my chest. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was mine to walk. It was strange, this feeling of possibility. After so many years of just trying to make it through, I had forgotten what it felt like to dream. But now, as I walked toward an uncertain future, I felt a spark of hope. It wasn't a grand, sweeping vision of what was to come, but a quiet certainty that I could carve out a new life, a life that wasn't defined by the war, by the loss, or by the pain. The quiet of the countryside was a stark contrast to the noise of the camp. There were no soldiers now, no prisoners, no routine that kept everything in line. There was only me and the road ahead. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The future wasn't a destination I feared anymore. It was a journey I was ready to take. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew that I had the strength to find my way. As I moved further, I came to a small village. The houses were modest, the streets peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I saw people going about their lives as though the war had never touched them. It was a humbling sight. I had once believed that the world was consumed by the darkness of war, that it had changed everything. But here, in this small village, I saw that life had continued, that people had carried on, despite the horrors they had endured. The realization hit me hard. The world was bigger than the war, bigger than the pain. It was full of people who had found ways to live, to rebuild, to heal. I realized that I could be one of those people. The village wasn't my destination, but it was a reminder that there was more to life than just surviving. I could build something here, something new. And maybe that was the key, finding the strength to start again, no matter how long it took. As I walked into the village, a small group of people waved at me. They looked curious, but not fearful. I smiled, a small, tentative smile, and waved back. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel out of place. I didn't feel like a stranger. I felt like someone who belonged. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I knew it was one I was ready to take. The war had stolen so much from me, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken my ability to change, to hope, to love, to find a place in this world. And that, I realized, was the most powerful thing of all. I had never thought much about home until I found myself standing in a small village, far from the camp where I had spent so many months, far from the world that had been defined by the war. The village was peaceful, almost idyllic, with houses lined up along neat, quiet streets. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and the distant murmur of families going about their lives. It was hard to believe that the war had touched this place, that the world I had once known had ever existed. I had thought that when the war ended, everything would go back to how it was before, simple, predictable. But now, standing in the sunlight, I realized how much had changed. Not just the world, but me. The man I had been, the one who had walked into that camp months ago, was no longer who I was. I had come to understand that the past, while never truly gone, no longer had the power to control me. I had been shaped by my experiences, yes, but I had also learned to shape my own path. As I walked through the village, I noticed the way the people moved, the way they seemed to exist in a world I had forgotten existed. They smiled at me as I passed, their faces open and warm, not questioning my past, not afraid of what I had been. It was strange, this feeling of being welcomed, this feeling of being allowed to simply exist. I had spent so long fighting, so long just trying to survive, that I had forgotten what it felt like to belong, to be part of something. But here, in this quiet village, I found that I wasn't just existing. I was living. It wasn't perfect. I knew that. The world was still recovering from the scars of the war, and I had my own scars that would never fully fade. But for the first time, I could see the possibility of a life beyond the pain, beyond the loss. I could see the possibility of a life that was mine to build. The journey wasn't over. I knew that. It would never be over, not entirely. There would always be pieces of the past that I carried with me, memories that would rise to the surface when I least expected them. But I had learned something important along the way. Healing was not about erasing those memories. It was about finding a way to live with them, to build something new from the fragments of what had come before. And that was what I was doing now. I wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but I was walking it with purpose, with hope, and with the knowledge that I had survived not just the war, but myself. The world had changed, but so had I. As I stood there, looking at the village in front of me, I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. The people I had met, the friends I had made, the kindness I had experienced, all of it had given me a new foundation. And with that foundation, I knew I could start again. There was no map for this journey, no clear instructions for what came next. But I knew that as long as I kept moving forward, as long as I kept trusting in the people around me, I would find my way. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. The village was quiet, the streets peaceful, and as I walked through it, I knew that I was not just walking into a new life. I was walking into a new beginning.